Jerome Henry Brudos was born in Webster, South Dakota on the 31st of January 1939, the younger brother of two sons born to Marie Eileen and Henry Irving Brudos. His mother had wanted her second child to be a girl and was very displeased that she gave birth to another son. She would frequently emotionally abuse and belittle her younger son, making no secret of the fact to Brudos that she'd wanted a daughter as opposed to another son. By contrast, Brudos' mother doted on her older son, James. The Brudos family lived a modest and pious lifestyle. Brudos' father typically held casual and often seasonal employment, whereas his mother was a homemaker. Although Henry was a short-tempered individual, he was rarely physically abusive toward or emotionally critical of his children, whereas Marie was harsh, matriarchal, and a prudish individual who reserved the majority of her de-ingration for her younger son. As a direct result of his lack of maternal acceptance, as a young child, he formed a close friendship with a neighbourhood woman of a similar age to his mother. The woman was both compassionate towards him and accepting to him throughout his visits, and Brudos later confessed to occasionally fantasizing that she was his true mother. However, the woman suffered from diabetes and a decline in health, forced her to cease permitting visits from him or any neighbourhood children. Shortly thereafter, a female childhood friend at the same age died of tuberculosis, leaving Brudos inconsolable. He was an unremarkable and sickly child with few friends who frequently complained of throat pains and migraines. He typically achieved average grades as opposed to his academically achieving and popular brother. In high school, he remained to be an unremarkable individual to his peers and teachers alike. He rarely engaged in extracurricular activities, although he is known to have been the secretary-treasurer of a youth club in his early teens. Largely due to his father's seasonal work, the family frequently moved home, typically around the Pacific Northwest, throughout Brudos' childhood before permanently settling in Salem, Oregon. This property was also located upon a farmland. Brudos harboured a lifelong shoe and foot fetish. He later recollected his fascination for women's shoes and feet, sourced from an incident where he, aged approximately 5, observed the teenager daughter of a family friend lying asleep on his bed, having been allowed to do so by Brudos' parents after she complained about feeling unwell. According to Brudos, he was transfixed by the sight of the girl's high-heeled shoes and attempted to pry them off her feet, to which the girl awoke and simply told him to leave the room. On another occasion at age 5, he discovered a pair of leather high-heeled shoes with a rhinestone-studded clasp while exploring a local junkyard. He took the shoes home, then slipped them on his feet to show his mother. In response, his mother shrieked that he was wicked and ordered him to remove the shoes and return them to the junkyard. Upon learning her son had secretly retained the footwear and that he frequently wore them secretly, his mother severely beat him before burning the shoes in his presence. 2 years after the incident, he attempted to steal the high-heeled shoes off a first-grade teacher. When caught, he confessed to his actions, although when asked why, he claimed not to know why he'd attempted to steal the shoes. By the onset of puberty, he'd also developed a fetish for women's underwear and lingerie. According to Brudos, he was introduced to the practice of viewing, fondling, and smelling female underwear by a neighbourhood boy with several older sisters, and with whom he occasionally sneaked into the girls' bedrooms to perform these acts, which evoked deep erotic feelings within him, which he initially failed to understand. As a teenager, he would steal underwear from female neighbours upon moments of opportunism, some of which he would later wear. By the onset of puberty, he still had not learned about sexual intercourse, although he became obsessed with viewing a naked female peer. However, he was markedly shy around girls in his neighbourhood and at school. Moreover, his height and severe acne further decreased his confidence and ability to appeal to girls. By approximately 1953, Brudos, still oblivious to the act of intercourse, had begun to masturbate. He later claimed to fail to ejaculate during the times of masturbation as a teenager, although he frequently experienced wet dreams. Whenever his mother discovered semen stains on his bedsheet, he was punished and forced to wash his own sheets. Brudos began stalking local women in his early teens, several of whom he discreetly photographed. He also stole and retained numerous items of lingerie and footwear. However, none of these initial offences were violent in nature, although by his mid-teens he had begun developing violent tendencies of forcibly possessing a woman. At the age of 16, he dug an underground tunnel, an alcove, close to his family home. This alcove was created to symbiotically enact the developing fantasies within his mind regarding captive women, and he had spent numerous hours within his lair at age 16 mentally hoping to entrap a captive. Although no women were confined at this location, Brudos did lure a neighbourhood girl to his bedroom to facilitate his sexual fantasies at the age of 16. Almost immediately upon luring the girl to his bedroom upon innocuous pretenses, Brutus exited the room only to reappear minutes later wearing a mask and brandishing a knife. He forced the girl to strip naked before proceeding to take several photographs of her before fleeing. Minutes later, Brutus reappeared wearing his original shirt with his hair in disarray and a minor scuff mark on his cheek, claiming that the intruder had locked him in the family barn at knife point. Within a year of his first known violent offence, Brutus had established a pattern of abducting girls of his own age or younger, typically at knife point, and forcing them into a barn upon his family farm before ordering them to disrobe before photographing them. He would lock the girls in a corn crib before reappearing several minutes later, wearing different clothing with his hair combed in a different fashion. He would then release the girl, explaining that he was Ed, Jerry's twin brother, and feign shock at her account of her ordeal before asking, "He didn't hurt you, did he?" Brutus would then claim that his twin brother, Jerry, was in therapy. This is going to set him back a bit, before pleading with the girl to not inform anyone of her ordeal and promising to locate and destroy the camera Jerry had used. None of these girls were subjected to physical sexual assaults but beyond tentative fondling, and all apparently agreed, as none are known to have informed authorities of these experiences. On one occasion in April 1956, Brutus persuaded a 17-year-old girl to accompany him on a date. Upon driving the girl to a deserted road, he ordered her to undress. The girl refused, whereupon Brutus dragged her from the car and proceeded to beat her, breaking her nose. The girl's screams and the general altercation attracted the attention of a young couple driving by, who stopped and intervened. Brutus then claimed the girl had fallen from the car, before changing his story to the claim that the hysterical girl had been attacked by some weirdo he had overpowered. His story wasn't believed, and the couple drove the two to the nearest police station, where Brutus admitted to attacking the girl but claimed that his intention had been to simply intimidate her into removing her clothes in order that he could photograph her. He denied having ever committed any previous acts of this nature and insisted his temper had simply gotten the better of him. He was then arrested upon charges of assault and battery. A subsequent search of his bedroom revealed his extensive collection of female clothing, plus numerous photographs of teenage girls, one of whom they were able to identify. The girl was contacted and revealed her ordeal at the hands of Ed's twin brother the previous August. Brutus was remanded in custody to be referred to the Polk County Juvenile Department. Brutus was treated as a juvenile offender and sent to undergo psychiatric evaluations with the Oregon State Hospital. He entered this facility on 16th of April 1956, where he remained for 9 months while permitted to leave the facility to attend high school. While at the facility, he was subjected to a range of evaluations. These tests concluded that he was a depressive individual who suffered from a schizotypal personality disorder but was not grossly mentally ill or suffering from delusions. Furthermore, the doctors at this facility concluded Brutus's sexual fantasies revolved around the hatred he harbored towards his mother and women in general. Upon completion of his evaluations, Brutus returned to live with his parents. An average scholar, he graduated 142nd out of a class of 202 students from Corvallis High School in 1957. 2 years later, in March 1959, he joined the army, where he trained as a communications technician. Although he became highly skilled in this profession, his military service was largely unremarkable, and he gained a reputation among his fellow soldiers as something of a fantasist who repeatedly claimed to be in a casual sexual relationship with a beautiful Korean girl whom he stated would sneak into his bed every evening. He was discharged from the army in October 1959, having been classified as psychologically unfit for military service. He moved back into his parents' 2-bedroom home in Corvallis, Oregon, and soon found employment at a local radio station as an electrical engineer. To his colleagues, he was an eminent, proficient, and conscientious employee who conveyed a mild-mannered demeanour, yet seemed to lack any ambition to advance himself despite being a licensed broadcast technician. Throughout the years that he resided with his parents, his mother would allow him to sleep in the second bedroom while his older brother was at college. When his brother returned home, he was forced to sleep in a shed at the rear of the property. On one occasion, in approximately 1960, he observed a young woman wearing revealing clothing. He discreetly followed this woman home to a Salem apartment, where he strangled her into a semi-conscious state before fleeing with her shoes. Shortly thereafter, he observed another young woman wearing high-heeled shoes. He attempted to overpower and strangle this woman, however she fought back and Brutus fled the scene with only one of her shoes. He retained the shoes of both women in the shed, frequently sleeping with them. He was not arrested for either of these offences. Approximately 1 year after gaining employment at the Corvallis radio station, he became acquainted with 17-year-old Ralphine Schwindler. He became acquainted with her via a teenage boy who, being an amateur electronics enthusiast, frequently visited the radio station to observe and question Brutus as to aspects of his work and who had jokingly remarked about his shyness around female employees. According to Brodos, he had jokingly remarked to the youth to find him a girlfriend. To his surprise, the teenager agreed and took him to Swindler's home. On the 30th of September 1961, Brodos and Swindler, 1 month pregnant at the time, got married. The newlyweds initially resided in Portland, Oregon, before relocating to a small house in the suburb of Salem in the summer of 1968. Their marriage ultimately produced 2 children, a daughter Teresa, born in 1962, and a son Brian, born in 1967. To supplement the family income, Brodos occasionally repaired vehicles in the family garage. Brodos was never physically or emotionally abusive towards his wife, although in the early years of their marriage he insisted she frequently walk around the house and perform housework naked except from a pair of high-heeled shoes. Often he photographed her before engaging in intercourse. For several years his wife acquiesced to these proclivities, but Brodos is not known to have committed any sexual offences during the early years of his marriage. By the mid-1960s, Teresa Brodos was a toddler, thus demanding more physical attention and nurturing from her mother. As such, Ralphine began to refuse to participate in the nude household high-heeled modelling, photography and sexual rituals should her daughter view her parents. Brodos had begun putting on weight. His wife would later state that, although she never informed her husband, his physical appearance had begun to repel her. As such, although Ralphine remained loyal to her husband, the two engaged in intercourse increasingly infrequently, with Ralphine devoting more of time to her daughter and social activities with female friends, and Brodos spending increasing amounts of time either working about the house or in his garage workshop, focusing on various electronics projects. In May 1967, as his wife was in hospital giving birth to their second child, Brodos discreetly followed a young woman wearing attractive high-heeled shoes to her home. He waited until nightfall before entering her apartment, whereupon he proceeded to choke her into unconsciousness. He would later state his intention upon entering the household didn't initially include rape, but the sight of a young, attractive woman laying limp and at his mercy beneath him aroused him to such a degree that he did rape her unconscious body before fleeing from her apartment with the high-heeled shoes. The following year, Brodos was arrested by Corvallis police while on the grounds of Oregon State University women's dormitory. He was charged with stealing women's clothing and wearing pedal pushers, high-heeled shoes, and women's underwear at the time of his arrest. Between 1968 and 1969, he abducted and strangled 4 young women and attempted to abduct a minimum of 2 others, 3 of whom were murdered in the basement or garage workshop of his home and 1 inside his vehicle. All of the women were abducted and murdered in order to satisfy his need to both dominate and possess attractive young women and satiate his sexual fantasy. Following the act of murder, each woman was subjected to a ritual of dressing in differing lingerie and footwear, during which Brodos would arrange her body in suggestive and provocative positions prior to photographing her body and engaging in masturbation, often while staring at or caressing the victim's feet and ankles after dressing the body in different lingerie or footwear. Each victim was also subjected to acts of necrophilia, and the 3 were mutilated after death, with Brodos retaining the severed body parts to fuel his fetishes in addition to expressing his dominance. All were disposed of in the Willamette River, although their shoes and underwear were retained and stowed within the household garage, which Brodos, his wife, and children were forbidden from entering without first announcing their intention via an intercom he had installed. Linda Catherine Slauson was a 19-year-old door-to-door encyclopedia saleswoman from Aloha, Oregon, whom Brodos encountered as he worked on his yard on the 26th of January 1968. She inadvertently entered his property, having confused his address with the neighbours, believing she had an appointment with the homeowner to potentially sell an encyclopedia. Upon hearing of the reason of her visit, Brodos feigned interest in purchasing a set of encyclopedias to lure her into the basement of his home. As she sat on a stool and began advocating the sale of her encyclopedias, Brodos bludgeoned her about the head with a section of wood, then manually strangled her to death before concealing her body beneath the staircase to the basement. He then asked his mother to take his daughter from the house to purchase hamburgers so that he could engage in necrophilia with Slauson's body. Upon undressing Slauson's body, Brodos discovered Slauson was wearing attractive red lingerie. This inspired him to retrieve a box of women's underwear and footwear he had accumulated, typically via theft, and repeatedly dress and redress her body in differing footwear and lingerie, in addition to engaging in repeated acts of necrophilia, photographing much of the process. Hours later, he severed her left foot from her body with a hacksaw. He kept it in the back of his family freezer, located in the basement, to use to showcase his extensive collection of high-heeled shoes and fuel his masturbatory fantasies. He also retained 2 encyclopedias she had hoped to sell him as keepsakes. He later bound the remainder of her body to a heavy cylinder head and had discarded her body over a rail somewhere in Marion County adding that he couldn't recall the precise location. Brudos encountered Jan Susan Whitney, a 23-year-old motorist, as he drove home from a job in Lebanon on the 26th of November 1986. He later insisted this murder, much like Sawson's, was a crime of opportunity. He'd simply encountered Whitney as he drove home from work and observed three people stand beside a broken-down Rambler alongside Interstate 5 between Salem and Albany. After inspecting her car, Brudos claimed he could fix the vehicle, but would need to drive home to collect the necessary tools. Whitney and her travelling companions, hitchhikers she had previously picked up, agreed to accompany him upon the promise that the two hitchhikers would be driven to their intended destination. The two hitchhikers entered the rear of Brudos' vehicle and Whitney in the passenger seat. After driving the hitchhikers to their intended destination, Brudos drove Whitney to his home, which he then entered whilst remaining parked in the driveway, ostensibly to receive the necessary tools to repair Whitney's car. He then discreetly entered the rear of the vehicle. As Whitney remained seated in the passenger seat, he asked her to close her eyes and describe how to tie a shoelace without opening her eyes or moving her hands. She agreed to the challenge. Brudos then strangled her from behind with a leather luggage strap before raping her body inside the vehicle. He then carried the body into his garage shop, where he dressed her body in differing footwear and lingerie before repeatedly engaging in acts of necrophilia with her corpse. Her body was left hoisted from a pulley in the workshop ceiling for 2 days, with Brudos later admitting to violating the body whenever he felt the need. Her body was also dressed in differing lingerie and repeatedly photographed. He also severed one of her breasts to use it as a paperweight, although the idea was abandoned when he noted the epoxy hardener had failed to fully set. He instead stuffed it with sawdust before pinning it to a wooden board. According to Brudos, 2 days after her murder, a car crashed into his garage, knocking a hole in the wall. A responding policeman had looked into the resultant damage, but due to the dust, debris and the darkness and the fact the hole was ground level, failed to observe Whitney's mutilated and suspended body. That evening, her body was tethered to a section of scrapped railroad iron and thrown into the Willamette River along with Lawson's severed foot, which had by this stage begun to decompose. 18-year-old Oregon State University chemistry student Karen Elena Sprinker was abducted at gunpoint from a parking lot outside Mayer and Frank department store while en route to meet her mother for lunch on the 27th of March 1969. Brudos, dressed in women's clothing at the time of this abduction, had impulsively driven his station wagon into the parking lot after observing a young woman wearing high-heeled shoes and a miniskirt at this location. Having parked his car and attempted to chase the individual, Brudos soon lost sight of her. En route back to his vehicle, he observed Spinkler entering her car and walking towards the department store. She was forced at gunpoint to enter the vehicle and accompany him to his home, with Brudos promising not to harm her. According to Brudos, Sprinkler repeatedly pleaded with him not to hurt her, adding that once taken inside of his workshop, she stated that she would do anything he wanted provided he didn't kill her. In response, he asked if she was a virgin. She replied that she was, adding that she was having a period. He then forced her to undress before proceeding to rape her on the workshop floor. She was then forced to pose in differing high-heeled shoes and underwear as Brudos photographed her. He then bound her hands behind her back before placing a rope around her neck. He then asked her if the rope was too tight. She replied that it was. In response, he threw the rope over the ceiling beam and pulled, causing her to be winched from the ground, whereupon she kicked a little and died. Over the following hours, Brudos repeatedly engaged in acts of necrophilia with her body. He also severed her breasts so that he could form plastic moulds with them. That evening, her body was lashed to a 6-cylinder engine component and thrown into the Willamette River. In April 1969, Brudos attempted to abduct 2 young women on consecutive days. Both escaped and reported their ordeal to authorities. The first of the women, 24-year-old motorist Sharon Wood, encountered him in the basement stairwell of a parking garage in Portland on the 21st of April 1969. She later recalled feeling a tapping motion on her shoulder, only to turn around to observe Brudos pointing a pistol at her face and ordering her not to scream. Although he attempted to restrain her with her arm lock, she fiercely fought him by biting and kicking him and twisting his wrist as she attempted to divert the pistol muzzle away from herself and towards him, while simultaneously biting deeply into his hand, causing him to slam her head into the concrete floor before fleeing the scene. The following day, a 15-year-old schoolgirl, Gloria Jean Smith, was forced at gunpoint to accompany Brudos to a green Volkswagen Carmen Ghia, with Brudos informing her. He then grabbed the rear of her coat and forced her to accompany him, but agreed to the child's request to let go of her coat as long as she walked alongside him. When Smith observed a woman working on a front lawn, she yelled and ran towards the woman, causing Brudos to flee from the scene. Smith later described her abductor as being in his early 20s, approximately 6 foot in height, weighing 200 pounds and wearing dark glasses. on the sex offenders matching this description were investigated but eliminated as suspects. 22-year-old removal firm secretary and part-time Portland State University student from Beaverton, Oregon, Linda Dawn Saley was abducted by Brudos from the grounds of the Lloyd Center shopping mall in the afternoon of the 23rd of April 1969. She had purchased a pair of slacks and a watch band as birthday gifts for a fiancé from the mall and was returning to a vehicle when she was approached by Brudos, who deceived her into believing he was a police officer by displaying a fake police badge and informing her that she was being arrested for shoplifting. Although she insisted her innocence, she agreed to accompany him to his vehicle, where she was informed she was being kidnapped for ransom. He then drove towards his home. He parked outside his garage and ordered her to follow him across the yard home, believing his wife and children to be relatives. However, at this moment, his wife appeared on the porch to inform him that she had planned the family dinner. In response, Brudos, over 10 feet from the porch, signalled Saley to stand still. He informed his wife that he'd be in the house in a few minutes, then returned Saley to the garage, where she was bound with cord. Brudos then entered the house, alone, to eat with his family. Upon returning to the garage, he discovered that she had freed herself from the binds, but had made no more efforts to escape. She then attempted to resist his immediate efforts to place the leather strap around her neck and pull her off her feet, asking the question, She then began to scratch and kick Brudos as he lifted her from the ground by the leather strap, although she soon became unconscious. Brudos then proceeded to strangle her to death as he raped her. Her body was then hung by the neck upon the same workshop pulley as Brudos' previous two victims. He then placed a hypodermic needle into a rib cage beneath each armpit, through which he ran an electrical current in an effort to animate her body. Disappointed, the experiment failed to produce dancing or seizure-like symptoms, but simply singed her flesh at the point of entry. Brudos rapidly abandoned his experiment. He retained her body for 24 hours, engaging in necrophilia on one occasion, before binding her body to a vehicle gearbox and discarding her in the Willamette River. Although he created moulds of her breasts, he didn't mutilate the section of her body as he had done with the previous women. On the 10th of May 1969, two fishermen discovered what they believed to be a large parcel floating beneath the surface of the water in a shallow section of Long Tom River. Upon closer inspection, they discovered that the parcel was actually the bound, bloated body of a young woman clad in a coat, weighed down by a large gearbox, with copper wiring twisted in a manner in which electricians trim electrical lines. The body was identified as Linda Saley. Due to the extent of decomposition, a subsequent autopsy was unable to determine whether she had been raped, although the coroner did rule her death as being due to strangulation. In addition, her autopsy revealed needle marks encircled by burning on each side of a rib cage close to her armpits, which had evidently been inflicted after death. 2 days later, an underwater search and recovery unit discovered the body of Karen Spinkler, approximately 20 yards from the river where Saley's body had been found. Her body was similarly weighed to the riverbed, in this case by a 6-cylinder head, and she had been bound with precisely the same cord and copper wire as Saley's body had been. Spinkler's autopsy determined that she died of either smothering or strangulation, and both of her breasts had been severed from the body after death. Although she was discovered wearing the same green skirt and sweater she had worn on the day of her disappearance, the size 38D bra on her were many sizes too large for her, and had been stuffed with brown paper toweling in an effort to stimulate a much larger breast size. The most predominant factors in linking the deaths of Saley and Spinkler to the same perpetrator were the fact that they had both been bound with the same brand of electrical flex, and that both had been weighed down with car components, suggesting that the murderer may have been an electrician or mechanic. In an effort to trace the origin of the auto components, several officers questioned employees and proprietors of all garages and junkyards in Western Oregon. Upon formally identifying both women, investigators also began questioning their family members and acquaintances. Police questioning of Spinkler's fellow students at Oregon State University revealed several female students have received phone calls in recent months from a man claiming to be a Vietnam veteran who'd asked to take them on dates. The man had used various aliases. Almost all either refused or simply hung up the phone. However, one had recently felt a degree of pity and allowed the man to take her on a date. She described the man as being Caucasian in his late 20s or early 30s, slightly overweight, with thinning blondish red hair and freckles. His vehicle had been a dirty station wagon with kids' clothes in it, leading her to believe that he'd actually been married. The date itself had been a largely unpleasant experience, and Brudos had sensed the student's increasing unease in his presence, at one point indicating that she had reason to be wary, stating, upon driving her home at the end of the date, he had asked her why she had changed her mind and agreed to accompany him, to which she replied that she'd been curious. According to the student, he replied, quote. Despite her desire to never accompany him on another date, she had not outwardly told him, and investigators asked her to contact them if the man ever called her again to ask for a date. She agreed. 1 week after the discovery of Saley's body, on the 18th of May, Brudos again contacted the young woman. He was arrested as he walked towards the agreed rendezvous that evening. Brudos provided police with the correct name, age and occupation, but gave a false address. With no legal basis to detain him, he was soon released from custody. Although a background check revealed his history of physical and sexual violence towards women, and a search of the vehicle database records revealed that he resided in the district of Portland where Linda Slauson had last been seen alive, and upon discovering Brudos' actual address, investigators discovered he currently resided just blocks from the department store where Karen Spinkler had been abducted. Furthermore, although he didn't drive a Volkswagen Comanche, investigators discovered that his mother owned one and that he had been in possession of the car on the 22nd of April, the day of the attempted abduction of Gloria Smith. Smith positively identified Brudos as the man who had attempted to abduct her. This information deemed sufficient probable cause to obtain a search warrant of Brudos' property. 8 days after his initial arrest on the 26th of May, a search of his property was conducted. Stored within his garage, authorities discovered a large amount of women's lingerie and footwear, a list of phone numbers of sorority houses and college girls living quarters, and numerous Polaroid photographs of young women, some alive, some obviously deceased. Almost all of the photographs had been taken in Brudos' garage, including several depicting a deceased woman hanging from the garage pulley with a mirror laid horizontally upon the floor directly beneath her feet. In one image, the reflection within the mirror depicted Brudos holding his Polaroid, indicating that he had taken the photographs. One of the individuals depicted in these photographs was rapidly identified as Karen Sprinker. She was depicted standing nude except for high-heeled slippers, with an expression of stern fear, contemplation, and/or apparent resignation on her face. A severed female breast coated with epoxy was also discovered upon a mantel in the living room. The police also discovered a coil of copper wiring determined to be precisely the same type used to bind the bodies of Linda Saley and Karen Sprinker to engine components prior to the disposal in the Long Tom River. One length of rope, confiscated by investigators, was tied in precisely the same manner used to bind the victims' bodies. In addition, numerous engine components were scattered and stowed around the garage. These discoveries were deemed sufficient to place Brudos under constant surveillance. By the 29th of May 1969, investigators had amassed sufficient evidence relating to their attempted abduction of Gloria Smith to arrest Brudos for his offence, as inquiries into the murders continued. He was discovered by Oregon State Troopers hiding beneath a blanket in the rear of the family station wagon as his wife drove the vehicle towards Portland. The following evening, Brudos was placed a phone call to his wife asking her to destroy further incriminating evidence, although his wife refused this request. Following this second arrest, Brudos was extensively questioned with regards to developments pertaining to the discoveries within his garage and his connection with regards to the missing and murdered young women, 3 of whom investigators had positively identified as Whitney, Sprinker, and Saley. He initially denied involvement with any of the cases, dismissing the evidence as circumstantial for several days, before gradually divulging his erotic fetishes and outlining how deeply ingrained they had become with his psyche and had subsequently severely impacted his daily life. By early June, he had provided investigators with a full confession to all 4 murders, which he subsequently outlined for police and later psychologists. He began out by outlining the opportunistic murder of Linda Slauson, whose name he was unable to recollect, which had not been linked to him, and which he admitted had been instigated largely because of the attractive high-heel shoes she had been wearing when she accidentally entered his property to sell encyclopedias, before outlining each of his subsequent murders and attempted abductions. Although he acknowledged ultimate responsibility for his crimes, he remained somewhat resistant when questioned with regards to aspects of reasoning and premeditation, simply stating at one stage, he denied a hatred of women, but admitted that the fact of killing enabled him to let off steam. The psychiatrist who examined him concluded that he was unable to achieve satisfaction from normal intercourse, and that the overriding motive behind his crimes were lust, adding that, even in the cases where he had killed women he had encountered in moments of opportunism, he had known he would ultimately murder his victim. Photographs he had taken of 2 of the victims were conclusively matched to the victims discovered in the Long Tom River, and his description of Whitney and her abduction matched sufficiently to the circumstances surrounding her November 1968 abduction to identify her as the second murder victim, although Slauson initially remained known as Jane Doe. He was appointed an attorney named Dale Drake, and an arraignment hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. on the 4th of June 1969. Brudos was formally charged with the murders of Whitney, Sprinker and Saley on the 4th of June. In response to an entered plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, at his initial arraignment, Brudos was subjected to a battery of psychiatric examinations by several doctors who unanimously concluded that he was sane and thus competent to stand trial. As a result, he was informed that his trial would be held on the 30th of June. On the 27th of June 1969, 3 days before his trial was scheduled to commence, he formally entered a plea of guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder. Before Marion County Circuit Court Judge Valdy Sloper, he was sentenced to 3 consecutive terms of life imprisonment with possibility of parole to be served in Oregon State Penitentiary. He repeatedly appealed his conviction, though every appeal was unsuccessful. Despite his insistence that his wife didn't know anything about the crimes and his insistence that he had forced her to drive the family wagon from their home on the date of his arrest, as he hid it within the vehicle on the 7th of August 1969, Ralphine Brudos was formally indicted for the first-degree murder of Karen Sprinker. These charges were initially filed in relation to an eyewitness account from an individual who claimed to have seen Brudos' wife assisting him in forcing a blanket-covered young woman into their property on the date of Sprinker's disappearance. Ralphine denied all knowledge of the crime. An eyewitness's account was refuted by other witnesses at her September 1969 trial. She was acquitted of all charges the following month. In the years following his assassination, Brudos became a model prisoner. Assigned clerical duties by the 1970s, he later utilised his electronic skills to maintain the prison's computer record system and install a cable television network, in addition to being entrusted with stocking, repairing, and maintaining the prison vending machines. As a convicted sex offender, he is known to have endured several physical assaults by fellow inmates, although in each instance he refused to name his assailants. He was also permitted to order mail-order catalogues depicting women modelling high-heeled shoes and underwear. He used this material to fuel his erotic and masturbatory fantasies. Brudos attended numerous parole hearings throughout his confinement. Family members of his victims constantly attended the hearings to request that he remain incarcerated for the duration of his life. On the 21st of June 1995, he was informed that he would spend the remainder of his life in prison. Nonetheless, he continued to attend informal parole hearings every 2 years for the remainder of his life. While incarcerated, he granted several interviews to numerous individuals of varying professions. One of these individuals was a former Marion County detective named Jim Burns, who later recollected a conversation with Brudos regarding compassion and remorse in which he asked, In response, Brudos picked up a section of paper from the table between the two. He crunched the section of paper into a ball, then threw the ball onto the floor, replying, Psychiatrist Michael H. Stone identified Brudos as having psychopathic personality, noting his callousness and lack of remorse for his crimes. Brudos died of liver cancer whilst incarcerated within the Oregon State Penitentiary at 5:10 a.m. on the 28th of March 2006. At the time of his death, he was 67 years old and the longest incarcerated inmate in the Oregon Department of Corrections, having served a total of almost 37 years imprisonment. Upon receipt of news of his death, the younger sister of Jan, Whitney, informed a reporter, This sentiment was echoed by one of the detectives assigned to the case, James Stovall, who stated, Shortly after his arrest, his wife was charged with being an accessory to murder in one of the crimes, despite his insistence that his wife had no knowledge of any of his abductions or murders. The Brudos children were taken into state care, and Teresa Brudos, aged 7, was later instructed to undergo questioning at her mother's upcoming trial. Following her October 1969 acquittal, Ralphine Brudos regained custody of her children. She divorced and ultimately severed all contact with her husband, changed her name, and relocated to an undisclosed state. Although Brudos professed his love for her for the remainder of his life, Brudos was never brought to trial for the murder of Linda Slauson. Though he confessed to Slauson's murder, and several Polaroid photographs discovered in his garage corroborated his admissions of having photographed her appendages, he was never tried for a murder due to insufficient real evidence. because although Brutus had retained photographs of her lower legs, ankles and feet, he had not photographed other areas of her body after death. As such, the photographs could not be proven to have been taken in life or death. Jan Whitney's body was found submerged in the Willamette River close to Independence, Oregon, exactly 1 month after his conviction. Her body was recovered approximately 1 mile downstream from the location Brutus had indicated and was identified via dental records. The body of Linda Slauson has sadly never been found. Brutus became known as the Lust Killer due to his primal motive behind his crimes. He also became known as the Shoe Fetish Slayer due to his lifelong shoe fetishism. Thank you for watching today's video. I hope you enjoyed. Are there any other true crime cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel? If so, let me know in the comments. What are your thoughts and opinions about this case? Also let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back next Friday at 5 o'clock with another true crime case.